Welcome to this condensed version of an assessment workshop I gave as part of the Camp Kendall 2020. It's assessment for whatever happens next year. This is going to be a brief overview of some ideas you can think about as you're thinking about assessing your courses, whether those be in-person courses, hybrid courses, or online courses. So the goals for the workshop and what I hope you'll be able to do after watching this quick video series is that you'll have some practice developing understandings and essential questions. We'll talk about what those are that drive your assessment and your teaching, and that you'll be ready to create one assessment or assessment plan that align your understandings and essential questions, and that can be used in different modalities. So again, whether you're in person or online or hybrid, or you thought you were going to be in person and you end up being online, or whatever happens next fall. So the first thing I want to talk about is aligning your course. This isn't specific to any modality. It's really just an issue of how you design your course and how you think about assessment within your course. And this part may be kind of obvious. More and more we talk in these terms, but certainly when I was learning about putting together courses, when I was first teaching, and for many years afterwards, this isn't how I thought. So I think it's useful to go back and to think about this process. I also find this to be a helpful process as I'm trying to sort through what I really want to assess and how I might go about doing that. Interested in more information on this, I would recommend this book called Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and Jay McAtee. It's a book that is written with educators from kindergarten to college in mind, so you'll find lots of different kinds of examples, but it does have a lot of helpful worksheets, a lot of helpful ideas. So if this is something you want to dig into, I would commend this book to you. But what I want to think through is what we're trying to get in a classroom for our students. And what Wiggins and McAtee talk about is this goal of understanding. We want our students to understand. And here's how they define that. To understand a topic is to be able to use or apply, in Bloom's sense, knowledge and skills wisely and effectively. An understanding is the successful result of trying to understand. The resultant grasp of an unobvious idea and inference that makes meaning of discrete and perhaps seemingly insignificant elements of knowledge. So in other words, what they're saying is we don't just want our students to come out of our classes knowing things, knowing a fact, knowing a skill. We want them to understand the big idea underneath the fact or the skill. We want them to be able to take what they learn in our courses through the content and be able to apply it in other situations or in other classes. Another way we talk about this is transfer. And as you may or may not know, transfer is tough. It's really hard for students to do. It's really hard to teach. And so what we're trying to do in this process is to design our courses for understanding or for transfer, to be explicit with ourselves and with our students about the big ideas, or what they're going to call enduring understandings, that are underneath all of the content that we teach. And that's the part that is what they call unobvious. For you as an expert, it's probably quite obvious, the understanding that's underneath all of the content. But for students, it's not. They tend to stay on that level of what is the obvious meaning of the content. What's this idea? What's this idea? Not necessarily what's the big understanding underneath those, what they see as discrete and often unconnected ideas. So in designing for understanding, they talk about 3 steps, and today I'm really going to focus on the first 2. Identifying the desired results, and we'll talk here mainly about understandings and questions, and then determining acceptable evidence. Here is a worksheet. This is available to you on the assessment website and I believe the Kendall Center website. I find this to be helpful in filling out for my courses or for a unit in my course where I can think about the big outcomes, whether those are general education outcomes or department outcomes, my understandings, the essential questions, and then the various tasks the students are going to do. And we'll walk through that here in a minute. So, first step, identify desired results. What enduring understandings do you want students to have? What essential questions do you want them to engage? What do they need to know or be able to do? I'm going to focus on those first two. Again, enduring understandings are the big ideas underneath your content. So as a religious historian, that might be kind of a general idea in my field. An idea like change over time, or an idea like religion is embedded in cultural, economic, and political contexts. It might be a more specific idea. So for me, again, that might mean that in the United States, religious diversity has been contested both as a reality and an ideal. That's an enduring understanding. I teach a lot of content about different kinds of religious diversity. I want students to have that bigger, enduring understanding leaving my class. So then when they go to the next class, they can look and say, oh, I'm now learning about a different place in the world at a different time, but I'm seeing some of these same themes, and I can apply some of what I've learned in this class to this class. What McTee and Wiggins argue is that for the most part, we don't get students to engage the enduring understandings themselves. We get at the enduring understandings through what they call essential questions, big questions that engage students. So let's take a look at what some of those might look like. An understanding, and again, this comes from their books, which can be for kindergarten through college, so remember that as I'm looking at some of these. An enduring understanding, the geography, climate, and natural resources of a region influence the economy and lifestyle of the people living there. That's an enduring understanding. The question you might pose to students or frame your course with or frame a unit is, how does where you live influence how you live? That's a much more interesting way to get into it, and those are the kinds of things that students are going to care about. I'll just do maybe one more down at the bottom. Dance is a language of shape, space, timing, and energy that can communicate ideas and feelings. That's an enduring understanding. The question that you might pose to students, or you might frame a course or a section with, is, how can motion express emotion? Okay? Those questions, again, can be kind of big, applying to an entire field. They can be smaller, applying a little bit more to specific content. But they're ways into the material that help students begin to see how specific content illumines and opens up these enduring understandings that they can take out into other places in their lives or other courses. So when I do this in one of my classes, this is for my FTS class, related to one outcome, I might have 3 understandings that I want students to get. There are varying evaluations of the effect of religion on society. I want them to think about how the rhetorical triangle, or I want them to understand how the rhetorical triangle can help them make persuasive arguments, and I want them to understand what counts as good support for an argument, and that it's related to audience. The essential questions I actually frame the course with and that we talk about that get them to these understandings are things like, can there be good without God? Is religion a net positive or negative for society? What is good evidence, and how do you persuade an audience? So I set up my course with these essential questions in mind, and I talk to students about them. I don't assume that what's obvious to me underneath the content is going to be obvious to them. We talk about the essential questions. We can push on those enduring understandings. So I might take a moment, if you are listening to this, and try this for a class or a unit of a course. What are the enduring understandings you're trying to help students see? Think about what you want them to take from your course to the next course. What are the essential questions you might use to get them there? So let's say you've now done that, or you've written some notes to yourself. We're going to talk a little bit more on the hands-on assessment side of things. And here, not to raise your anxiety, but a lot of the material I have read about online and hybrid learning suggests that alignment, so alignment between outcomes and understandings and questions, and then assignments or assessments, matters more in hybrid and online courses than it does in in-person courses. It matters a lot in in-person courses, but because students don't have the kind of regular contact or the in-person contact of in-person courses in hybrid and online courses, the structure of your course, the way that what you're trying to get them to understand and the assessments you're using to help them understand those things and to assess whether they understand them need to be even clearer to students. So as you set up courses in a hybrid or online environment, think about that. Am I being explicit with my students about how what I want them to understand, the questions we're asking, relate to the assessments or the assignments that they're doing and I'm having them do? All right, so you might be thinking, this is supposed to be about assessment. When are we going to talk about assessment? Well, here it is. Basically, assessment boils down to this. How will you know that students have the enduring understandings that you want them to? What evidence would you use to say, yep, they understand these things? Wiggins and McTee talk about these kinds of assessments as performance tasks. And a performance task is one that involves an authentic audience. So their argument is that in any class there should be one performance task, something that students could do out in the world somewhere. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be an academic paper. It can be. Academic audiences exist, but it should then seem like there's an academic audience. The performance task doesn't have to go to a real audience. You don't have to go find an audience who will look at this piece of work, but students should be writing, if you want to think about it this way, as a faux authentic audience. Some group that you could name that you would be doing this kind of project for as one way of measuring their understandings. Then I also say then you'll of course need informal and formative assessments. You'll need quizzes and tests and responses to prompts and all those kinds of things we use. So it's a layered assessment practice. And those all together will help you know if your students understand the things that you want. I find this chart to be really helpful, this chart that is circular priorities and assessment methods. So they talk about three different levels: big ideas and core tasks, important to do and to know, worth being familiar with. And they argue that you assess those differently. The big ideas, the core tasks, right, are things that you assess through the performance task and projects, and then partly somewhat in other ways as well. But that's the key thing, right? You're trying to get the big ideas through your performance task. And then if things are important to know and to do, your performance task will almost inevitably assess those. But that's also where you use what they call more traditional assessment methods. So quizzes and tests, response papers, those kinds of traditional assessments that we're accustomed to. And then worth being familiar with. Probably if you're going to assess them at all through traditional methods, this is a good moment to decide if you need to assess these things whatsoever, or how many of them need to be in your class. One of the things I find helpful with that alignment exercise is it helps me figure out the difference between things I enjoy teaching, things that as an expert I think I need to know, and what it is my students really need to be introduced to in order to get the enduring understanding. There are things that I love to teach that I have realized over the years don't need to be in my courses. And I think even more so when I taught briefly, like we all did this spring, remotely, I took even more of those out, realizing that the key things that students really needed to explore, to work with, the content they needed to engage those essential questions, to get to those enduring understandings, weren't all of the things that I think it would be great if they knew. This helps with prioritization. So when it comes particularly to hybrid and online modalities, the consensus of experts is that you should have a mix of low stakes and high stakes assessment with performance tasks. One of the things that comes through in this consensus is that there should be more frequent low stakes assessment in online and hybrid courses than in in-person courses. I'm careful with that at Gustavus. I think a lot of times pedagogical books written for the college level are oriented towards larger schools they think about larger student classrooms. I think they're speaking to people who might think in terms of a midterm and a final. For a lot of us at Gustavus, continual assessment in low stakes ways is a pretty regular part of what we already do. So my encouragement here would be to keep doing that, but to think about ways to make that possible for you in an online or hybrid environment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing to remind you is that as teachers, we're always assessing. I think sometimes we think of assessment as this other thing that we now suddenly do. Good teachers are always assessing. Assessment doesn't always mean that students are being graded. You're assessing when you're reading a discussion board and you think, wow, they really didn't understand this concept. Or you're assessing when you're getting emails and you see, oh, wow, there's something that students who are really interested in exploring more, or they want more information on. All of that is assessment. So as you think about your course, it's useful thinking about, how do I get feedback that will help me make changes in the course as we go along that are important? What's the assessment I need to do where students need feedback? And where are each of those in my plan? All right, so performance tasks, a few ideas, things that either I have tried or other people at Gustavus have tried or someone out in the world has tried. Having students write op-eds, that's an FTS staple now. Again, it's an authentic audience. Websites, you can use Google Sites for these. Creating a brochure, particularly if you're working with, say, a community partner or some other kind of work product for a community partner. A letter can be a really useful performance task with again, an authentic audience, whether or not they send the letter or not, having someone or some group that they are writing to. Debunking thread on Twitter with links, so those kinds of multi-linked Twitter threads where you start with some atrocious thing somebody has said and then you explain all the reasons that is incorrect. Creating a podcast, or again, an article, whether scholarly or general interest. There are certainly other kinds of ideas, but all of these things are performance tasks, things students can do that have authentic audiences. Some tips for your performance task in a class. Now again, remember, this performance task should be helping students engage those essential questions and helping them get at those enduring understandings. Keep that in mind as you're creating this performance task. There should be a through line from the outcomes to the enduring understandings, through the essential questions, to the performance task. If that's not aligned, you need to rethink something. Maybe you've got the right performance task and you've got the wrong understandings. Maybe you have the wrong understandings or the right understandings and the wrong performance task. All right, some tips as you think about performance tasks, again, not only for online and hybrid modalities, but certainly very important when you think about those modalities. First is to introduce the final performance task early in the semester. This helps students think about what they're learning in terms of a task that is going to hopefully help them pull things together and get at those understandings. One way to do this would be, for example, to give the prompt to students in the first week or two of the semester and have them write a response to the prompt. What do I know already that would help me in this task? What will I need to learn, both in terms of content and in skills, in order to perform well on this task? What do I understand about the prompt? What do I not understand about the prompt? Something that helps students think about what you're going to have them do, but also think about their own learning in conversation with this task. Obviously, we want to help students understand the assignment. This is true for in-person learning, but again, when you take away that in-person element, even more important perhaps in online and hybrid contexts. So have a written prompt. I think this is important in in-person contexts too, but students need something they can go back and read. They need something they can take to the writing center. They need something they can refer to. I found it really helpful last spring. I know other faculty did too, and I heard very much from students that particularly in hybrid or online environments, they appreciate having posted verbal instructions. So not only to give them written instructions, but then to do something like this, where you create a video and post it to, say, your Moodle page, where you walk through the assignment so that they can go back and refer to that. In addition to the written example, and then to have anchor papers, assignments, or examples that they can look at. Obviously, you want to scaffold the performance task, and here you might be doing that in a couple of ways. One might be that you're having them practice skills in low stakes assessment that they will use in their performance task. So again, in my field, I might, in low stakes assessment, be having them read primary documents and respond to them or exegete them in some way, and then they might do that for a performance task. The key here is to tell them that that's what's going on, that, hey, you've done this skill here, and you will be doing this skill here. Again, that seems obvious to a lot of us. Of course, what I'm having you do in a low stakes assessment has to do with your high stakes assessment, but it's not always obvious to students. Don't ask them to read your mind. If you're asking them to practice a skill one place, remind them that they've practiced that skill, or foreshadow where that skill will be used. Help them make those connections. And then scaffold, have multiple stages. So have them turn in pieces of it and build the performance task over time. Now, all that may just seem like it's asking you to do a lot of work, and you're already stressed out because you're teaching a modality that you never wanted to teach in, and there's a global pandemic and all other things going on in the world. So, how do you do this? Well, first of all, multiple stages does demand thinking seriously about the kind of feedback you're going to give. So, think about whether or not you want to move to screen capture. A lot of our faculty are now doing this, where they walk through a student work product using something like Gene or Screenotastic, something that allows them to show the student the screen as they give feedback. The great thing about a lot of those programs, if you use the free version, is they usually give you 5 to 10 minutes free, which means that you can only talk then to the student for 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, you could cheat the system and send students like 30 different, 5-minute things, but that would be dumb, because what you're trying to do is to give students the amount of feedback they can actually use. Still, Word document comments works for a lot of people. That's what I still use. I write and think at the same time, to the extent that I think at all, I guess. So that works for me. But one of the things that I do is I manage to keep myself to, say, 3 comments for improvement, and then meetings with students. In all of this, one of the questions I get is, so if we have students get comments, then they expect those comments to move them from whatever grade they're at to, say, an A. I try and be really honest with my students about what comments do. That comments don't move you from wherever you are to an A, but that comments, that feedback, working with that, move you to whatever the next level is. So I'm trying to get you to the next place, not necessarily up to an A, unless that is the next place for you. Keep it manageable. So use peer review and self-review. Have students go through their own papers with a checklist so that they do some of the basic work in advance. Do you need to be spending your time thinking about exactly how their footnotes are formatted? Probably not, if they can have a checklist and they can see how that's going for them. Use a rubric. Tell students what you expect. Give it to them in advance so they know what they're shooting at. Have them go through their own paper with the rubric so that when you give your feedback, you can see, this is how this student is thinking, he or she is doing. Here's how I think this student is doing. I'm going to orient my feedback to places where we disagree or things that they're not seeing, right? If the student knows the introduction sucks, I can say, like, you evaluated yourself well, but what you didn't know is that your middle paragraphs lack topic sentences. So think about things where students can also help themselves. Do feedback for improvement. Feedback for improvement. Feedback when students aren't going to redo the assignment or revise the assignment usually goes nowhere. I was certainly the kind of student in college, and probably you were too, who read all the comments on all of the papers I ever got back at the end of the semester. But that turns out isn't normal. A lot of students will simply look at the grade. So think about feedback for improvement. And if this is the last draft, if they're not improving it, think about saying something like, If you would like more feedback on your paper, I am happy to meet with you next semester. Or you can email me and ask me for more feedback. But I have found that most of you simply, by the end product, just you're done with my feedback. The other thing is to time yourself. Say, I have 20 minutes to grade this paper. I will give myself 10 minutes to write comments. Time yourself and keep to it. Okay, so then we have traditional assessment ideas. Some of these are higher stakes, the traditional test. Some of them are low stakes, discussion boards, exploratory writing, and other kinds of low stakes tests. I will say that I have never met a discussion board I like. I think that's my own failure from everything I've read and other faculty members I've talked to who use them to great effect. So what I will say is that talking to faculty who have used them well, who've had success with them, and in my reading, you need to be really thoughtful about discussion boards. Students aren't, for the most part, simply going to sit around and just sort of discuss. You need to set up a question or activity that is open-ended so that they actually have things to talk about, but that do things that make sense on a discussion board, like asking students to use core concepts in a new setting, or asking them to think about how their personal experience relates to something you're studying, or asking them something that is open-ended but really gives them a lot of direction. I use exploratory writing more, where it's just a communication between me and the student, so they write a response to a reading or something like that. That's, again, probably just because I've never done a discussion board well, but that for me works pretty well, and I don't spend a lot of time on grading. I'm looking at them in terms of engagement, and I'm pretty clear, if you are, in my case, engaging primary text, you will get full credit on this. I give a few comments. If everybody's making the same errors, I make them to the class. If it's more individual, I do it more individually. I find that I enjoy reading these things. They really do give me a sense of how students are interacting with the material. Some suggestions on traditional assessment. If you're doing a test or a quiz and you want to know how to keep students from cheating, there are various schools of thought. One is that you can't. There are people who will tell you that every test ever created is out there somewhere on the web, including yours, and students will cheat, and that's just the end of it if you're doing something online. There is, however, some research that says that if you put the honor code up front and they have to agree to it at the beginning of a test, students are less likely to cheat. You can also do things that mitigate cheating, or the desire to cheat or the opportunity to cheat. So putting one, if you're doing a Moodle test or quiz, one question on time so students can't just download the whole thing and post it. Timed tests, although that has implications if you want to do universal design or be compliant with ADA for all of your students. You can think about things that are application things that are very much oriented around your course material, so they can't just get it off Wikipedia. There are kind of multiple mitigations you can do that make it less likely students will cheat. Another thing that I do is, and this is number 4 here actually, is I allow students to redo tests, not completely, but on anytime I do a multiple choice, here's just stuff I want to make sure you know kind of test, I let them go back and do what I call test corrections, where they can go back, find the right answer, tell me where they found it in their notes or their reading, so they have to go to their notes or their reading, and they get half the points back. And I find that that relieves some anxiety for students and makes cheating a little less attractive because they know that the test is something that they can go back and redo. It also means that they've learned the material, ideally, that they didn't understand. Point 2 here is that you can use the feedback feature in Moodle for particular questions or for the test as a whole. So you can say, like, if on question 2, every time students choose a wrong answer, if you want them to be able to go back and redo the test, say, you should look at chapter 2 again for more on this question or something like that. So you automate the feedback up front so you're not having to do individualized responses for everyone. People talk about test wrappers, so having students analyze their tests and their study patterns and thinking about how to redo or do things better. I already said number 4. And then number 5 and 6 kind of go together, using what some people call mastery and then specifications grading. These aren't quite the same things, but they're related. One way of thinking about some traditional assessment, particularly on things you really want students to know, is to have low stakes quizzes. You could do these through Moodle pretty easily, where students have to get 100% in order to get the credit for it. So if you had reading quizzes or things like that, where they can redo them multiple times and they have to get 100%. Specifications grading, it's not always called that, but I'll call it here, or standards-based grading, is when you say, here are the standards in this class, or here are the things you have to know or be able to do. And what I will tell you is, I'll ask you a question that applies to a couple of the standards. So I say have 10 standards in my class. I'll ask a question on a test that applies to standards 1 and 3. Maybe you have to answer a test question that applies to each standard 3 times in order to complete that standard. Then once you're done with that standard, you don't have to answer test questions related to it anymore. And then in order to get, say, a D in my class, you have to get 6 of the standards. In order to get a B, you have to meet 8 of the standards, and then there's some extra work, however you wanted to do that, that would boost grades up, so that students are seeing not simply grades, but are they meeting the standards? And again, you can do that online, you can do that in a hybrid environment, you can do that in person, in any way that in any of those modalities. So those are all ways of doing assessment. So again, thinking about, what do I want students to understand? What are the questions we're going to use to get into that? What are the big performance tasks that I'm going to use to evaluate students knowing these things, understanding these things? And then what are the more traditional assessments I need to get for the specific content or skills that I also want to assess in my course? Having done all that, this is now where you go and say, okay, so what's my reading list? Or how am I going to use the textbook? What chapters am I actually going to use? What am I going to lecture on? When are we going to break into small groups? Whatever those kinds of questions are, that's what you do last. When I was coming out of graduate school, the first thing you decided was your reading list. In this approach, it's one of the last things that you decide. So now it's up to you to try it. Again, a lot of this stuff works in multiple modalities, which is great. You can think about a performance task that students will turn in online. Maybe it's a website, or maybe it's a brochure, something that they can do online, they'll turn in online. So if your course moves suddenly to be a hybrid course or an online course, you're already doing that. Thinking about ways to use Moodle or Google Sites that will allow you to do a lot of these kinds of performance tasks and traditional assessments. And again, they can move back and forth. I will probably start having students bring in computers, and anytime I do a multiple choice test, just do it on Moodle, because that's simpler than me going through lots of paper. So think about the ways that these assessments can be done on multiple modalities. The key point here is that whatever modality you're using, the process functionally remains the same. What are the big ideas? What are the questions we're going to use to pursue those big ideas? What's the big task I'm going to use that helps students bring that together? That's the focus of our semester together, that helps them really unpack these ideas. What are the other assessments I need to know as we go along the way to make sure they're getting what they need? At the end, I can assess how well they got that. And then what are the activities we're going to do each day to get us there? Thank you for watching. If you have other questions or I can be of help this year, please let me know. And my name is Sarah Rubel. I'm the assessment director. So please, if you have anything you want to talk about in terms of planning your course or assessments, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to talk. Thanks for watching.